Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Larry.
Okay, so it's 6:15
Yes,
now.
like
So, welcome back to our class. And I've seen that all 40 of you have submitted the quiz already. So I think we can start. Before we start, I would like to ask for your, understanding. And forgive me for delaying our class. I had suffered from kind of illness. My throat is infected and severely inflamed. Right now, I'm still in recovery, so please excuse me with my low voice. I know it's not good. I'll try my best to make sure that you heard me well. Is this okay, or do I have to speak up louder in this?
I can hear you well, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Please bear with
It's okay, sir. You can talk like that, sir. No need to raise your voice.
me. Thank you very much. So, you, after the quiz, I think you already know where were we last class, right? So part of the quiz is to uh, revise again what we have been through last class and connect it to this class as well. Today will be our, is it seventh or eighth class? Eighth or seventh? I'm not quite sure. I think it's seven. Yeah,
Sven, sir, Sven.
yeah. Hopefully, thank you. So, uh, in accordance with syllabus, we're supposed to cover the municipal law and international law, but we already touched on that during our first and second, third class, and I think it's more important to cover this as class of treaty rather than going through that, and we'll see we can cover that class after midterms or something because it's not that important much. So again, for today's class, the topic is treaties. Treaty is, as you already know from our introductions, under popular international law. It is one of the main source of international law. So category number one is treaty or international agreement itself already. Therefore, it's very important for us to learn what is it, how to establish it, how do we adopt it, how do we form treaty, what are the format, and what are the process of making treaty. We'll begin to understand what is treaty itself and who define treaty. Um, uh, Most of you have, I have seen the quiz already, the quiz answer, so most of you got the correct answer about and get to know about the Vienna Convention on Law treaties. Basically, a treaty that defines treaty, in short. Uh, Vienna Convention's law treaty was adopted since 1950, 58, 59, yeah, 59, and sorry, 69, uh, and it took 11 years for the treaty itself to be able to enter into force because of the triggering elements of ratifications of member who joined the treaty. So if we're talking about history of the treaty itself, it's even take 11 years for a treaty to be a treaty fully in effect. That is, or we could say the mother treaty. You know, it's quite funny. Article 1 of the VCLT says that it only applies to treaty. So let's take a look. What does the article 1 say? I will change sorry. Wait. Can you see the screen sharing of the PDF?
yes,
Yeah. So can someone read this? A. Udam, can you read this A?
Yes, sir. So, treaty means an international agreement concluded between states in written form and governed by international law, whether embodied in a single instrument or in two or more related instruments, and whatever its particular designation.
So, as we already learned that international law could be an instrument that bound between, or a treaty could be an instrument that bound between more than just states, because international law applies to all subjects of international law, such as states themselves, IGOs, international government organizations, corporations, and individuals. But have you noticed that the Vienna Conventions on the Law of Treaties only cover the agreement that conclude between states specifically? Why? What about international agreement that concluded between states or state versus international organization? Will it be covered? Is it strange? Do you find it strange? It is. It isn't that strange. Why? Because even though at the time of 1969, what's more important for a convention to start being the mother of the treaty, or showing the path of how treaty, or in the in simple term international agreement, how are they concluded, they focus only between states because it's more important. States could relay the obligations from to individuals, and individual itself sometimes represents states, just like head of states, to form a treaty. And there is another, I mean, separate movements and frameworks that govern the conclusions of international agreement between states and international organization itself. But it's kind of funny because if we look deeply, the Vienna Conventions on the Law of Treaty is is the is the piecework of the UN itself. It's related to the International Law Commissions, which is part of the international government organizations. They have intentions in mind that these should be the objective, that the Vienna Law Conventions on the Law of Treaty will only govern the international agreement between states. Sorry. So let's get back to our slide. So again, more than just between states, there the Article 1 and subparagraph A lay down the elements of international agreement itself, that it has to be in written form and it has to be governed by international law. So three conditions. One, is concluded between states. Two, it's in written form. Three, it's governed by international law. Whether it is in the format of one instrument or in the format of two or more related instrument in whatever particular designation. Simply, I think most of you would know what is protocol, you know. They also, but annex is part of the treaty itself, but it could be, how do you call it? Conventions, covenants, international agreements, and then you have protocol, additional protocol, so you name it. So it could be three or four piece of framework, but together it form an international agreement, like a series. So it could be one agreement. It could be one agreement, three protocol. For example, the Geneva Conventions regarding the international humanitarian law. So the 1949 Geneva Conventions consist of four Geneva Conventions series. We call Geneva Convention 1, 2, 3, and 4. One is shipwrecks, seas, and prisoners of war, and then uh, the number 4 is occupations. So, and the Geneva Convention itself having four with three additional protocol. So together it work together. It bind as one. You know. So again, treaties have three elements. It is an international agreement that conclude between state. in written form and governed by international law. So if you're to be asked in whatever it is, exam or whatever, oral or written, you just have to say that international treaty is an international agreement in written form, governed by international law, and concluded between states. Three elements describe in short what is a treaty. And VCLT, the Vienna Convention on Law Treaty, Article 2, it's it's just a funny thing that it's a treaty of a treaty. So we can call it the mother treaty. So let's look into the one of the elements, each and every one of the elements of the VCLT. I mean, the number one is not the element, but it has to be format. The existence of the treaty itself is an international agreement, so it has to be in written form uh, and 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 between two or more states and governed by international law. Article 3 is just bearing in mind of the VCLT that uh, the treaty of the VCLT itself is not really prejudice without prejudice to the other agreements or other party or other forms. So it's not that it has to exist within the VCLT as long as that international agreement is follow any other rules, customary rules, even before or after the formation of VLCLT, it still work fine. It could govern themselves. You know, it doesn't have to be fully affected by the VCLT because even though the VCLT itself is the mother treaty, but what happened before that? What governs the way of how international agreement being adopted? There's no. So it goes back again to just the revisions of our first and second class. Sometimes customary international law is the one who form treaty, push for treaty. For example, we can take a look of something in uh, the uh, the the preamble of the VCLT itself. The, if you look at the here, if you look at the preamble, they said that the state party to the present convention, considering the fundamental role of treaty in the history of international relations, and treaty itself is a source of international law. And last but not least, they said that affirming that rules of customary international law will continue to govern questions not regulated by provisions of this present convention. The last sentence or the last paragraph of the preamble of the VCLT alone simply explained that the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaty are born from international customary international law. They're trying to codify what have been produced in customary international law already. They tried, but they couldn't cover all of it. So therefore, let's say the existence of the rule of customary international law regarding treaty making consists of 50 points. They can only cover and explain and ask and gather state to agree only 30 points. The 20 points that are still not uh, explicitly codified within this treaty will continue to govern by international law and guiding the VCLT itself as the fundamental principle of interpretations. So again, this just to remind you that the way that the source of international law work between treaty and customary international law, sometimes treaty itself will form and then it was forged or transformed into customary international law because it was purely and popularly practiced and bind state opinion juris with the number and years of state practice. then it formed customary international law. But sometime in this case of VCLT, customary international law exists first, and then states and the UN itself trying to codify customary international law to put into a written form of treaty so that more states could join. Uh, how do I say it? Directly, not to discuss whether they are to be bound by customary international law or not. So remember this point, it's quite important. Let me change the again. So this is what I have mentioned to you. So it just take more time to explain. If I don't explain, I don't think this text is enough for you. Principle of Pacta sunt servanda. So let's see, what is principle of Pacta sunt servanda? The Article 26 of principle. Anyone have heard about the principle of Pacta sunt servanda?
First time, sir.
First time?
No, sir. No, sir.
And what? Anyone? If you know and can explain, you get one bonus. I mean, it's easy here.
Teacher, can I try?
Yeah.
Protestants wonder means that treaties must be respected by state.
How about again to help you, we'll go to the Article 26. What's again? Can you do it again? Hello? Can you explain again?
From what I have read before, Protestants wonder means that treaty must be respected by state.
Treaty must be respected by state.
Yeah,
State,
teacher.
not really enough. I mean, it's not touch upon what's important of Pacta sunt servanda. What is the
Sir,
key?
can I try, sir?
Yeah,
So it means that the agreeing parties must uphold the treaty
in
in good faith, like
yes, yes.
like
So the
they,
you're correct.
yeah, yeah,
So the intentions of the principle of Pacta sunt servanda is that by the time of adopting, we can say signing and then ratify and then coming to force. We don't know how will state perform their obligation yet, right? They could perform it in any way they want. So principle of international law, Pacta sunt servanda stated that upon binding, you have your obligations. As a party, you are bound by this treaty. As long as it is in force, you will perform your obligation. It's a must. But you have to perform them in good faith, not with the bad intention. And the principle of Pacta sunt servanda is not just end here. The reason why they explicitly stated that you have to perform in good faith, which means that in case that you perform in bad faith, it could result in breach or violations of the agreement itself, or could lead to invalidity of the agreement, which is why it is explicitly stipulated under this Vienna Convention on the Law Treaty. And it is not just this convention. Basically, the pure the genesis of international law, we have to understand that law itself is just agreement. It's just something you sign. It's just something you agree to, but you don't know how you perform in the future yet. So during the genesis of the creations of the principle of international law itself, it is the principle of good faith is embedded strictly into the how do I call it, the performance of obligations when it is bound with two actors. It's not just about the state versus states, the principle of good faith even derive from like a smaller contract. Let's say if you borrow money from your friend, you don't have any, it's a gentleman agreement. Okay, can I borrow 5,000 reals? I'm short of cash. I need to eat my lunch. Tomorrow I'll pay you back. So you let your friend borrow 5,000 real and he will pay you back tomorrow. It was done in good faith because you believed that he borrowed your money because he needed and he will pay you back. Maybe with 500 reals interest, you know? You don't expect that he's gonna boom you and not gonna pay you back just 5,000 real. So this is the principle of good faith. It starts from a simple, small agreement, gentleman agreements, or a contract between two. It is the expectations to perform the obligation in good faith, and this upgraded or emerged from just normal contract into uh, a higher forms of agreement into an international agreement, and it is embedded in every public international law uh, principle, as long as it's related to international legal personality, or another one, as long as it is about rights and obligations. The principle of good faith embedded closely to the performance of obligations and the entitlement of right. Pakta sunt servanda. Let's change the slide. So let's move on. Sorry. Uh, this is just to remind you about the validity and the continuance of enforce of a treaty. So uh, validity, the reason why we're talking about validity is because when we talk about obligations is when the treaty is enforced. So after, let's say, the VCLT came into force in 1980s, and then the validity, that's where we're talking about the validity, like how is it being valid, and how long and how it continued to be enforced, because the validity itself and continuing to be enforce itself is binding with the obligations, how state will perform the obligations. The validity of a treaty or of the consent of the state to be bound by a treaty may be impeached only through the applications of the present convention. So the convention itself speaks about validity of itself. You'll find a lot of agreements at the end talking about the validity, mostly at the end of the agreement. The termination of a treaty, its denunciations or withdrawal of a party may take place only as a result of applications of provisions of the treaty or of the present conventions. The same rule applies to suspensions of operations of the treaty. This simply means the treaty governs itself. The VCLT, even though as a mother of treaty, did not lay formula on how the treaty uh, being valid or continue to be enforced or be terminated or withdrawal or whatever it is, suspensions or pause of obligations. The VCLT said that the treaty that will likely be created or called international agreement had the rights to codify their own way of how validity and continue to be enforced work. And saying this, it means that in order to uh, uh, adopt or form a treaty, the draft or the element of treaty itself have to have some provisions regarding the validity and the continuations or the terminations or the suspension, at least. And you will see in every treaty, almost at the end of the treaty, the latest chapter or latest provision, it's talking about how it's being enforced, how will it be an amendment, and how will be it terminated, how long will it last. It's always put in the last text, and it become the most important as well, because that's how uh, uh, they determines what your right and obligations are entitled for how long and how long will it last. And specifically, it's about in case of conflict as well. How they sue you, how they make sues as well. If the validity is end, you can sue. If the subject matter or the conflict happened before it have even validity itself, you cannot sue to court or to any dispute resolutions. So right now we want to start with the formation first. We'll focus on four main issues of the treaty, but we'll start with the formations. So the question is, how do we create a treaty? What is the process of formations? Do we need all of them? Stage by stage, step by step, or we can just skip one? The VCLT said you need all of them. So the process of formations are divided into four. How do we create a treaty? Stage 1, adoption of the text. Stage 2, authentication. Stage 3, consent to be bound. Stage 4, entry into force. Let's look at stage 1, adoption of the text. Normally, when you start a job, how do you agree with your contract? Anyone, most of you must have worked, right? I don't know. Odam, are you working right now?
Yes, sir. I'm a workplace.
Is it the government or private sector?
Uh, Private, international.
Okay, so when you start your job, they offer you a contract and you see it, right? A
Yes, sir.
draft.
Yes,
Uh,
sir.
did you look through it like thoroughly, or just
Yes, sir. We look at everything, sir. It might be a clause that they might exploit you.
yeah? So simply saying they provide you the draft, right? We can say that. But did you negotiate? Did you try to negotiate with them saying that, hey, I don't like this provision, should we change? Because this is an agreement. Did you negotiate?
Yes, sir. Like, but some case, sir, only working time and salary, sir.
Yeah, that's what you care most, right?
Yes, sir. Because the rest is the same like the other.
Yeah. So at least there are some sort of agreements before you adopt the text. And before there is agreement, there have to be discussions. And the agreements upon the text through discussion is the first stage of adopting formations. So normally, if we're talking about an international agreement, a big international agreement, which is multilateral party, 30, 50, or 100, or 200, I don't know, more. Often the text was drafted by the international law commissions, mostly. Since the establishment, international law commissions have a lot of draft texts of international law in hand. And sometimes those who are interested party come and meet together in a conference to start the idea. How should we draft the text? After that, they would give their idea to or recorded the idea to the International Commission, and the International Commission would produce that. Or sometime a group of states or maybe a single state who is powerful enough work together or work alone to say, hey, I got a draft text. If you want to talk about this, How about having a meeting or conference in, I don't know, Toronto, Canada, to see what I have? I invite everyone to come to this conference and look at the draft. I have a good idea. So it could be at international conference. Most often it is called initiative. So initiative, it's rarely by country purely. It could be a group of countries. So a country alone would not be enough. But most often by the international law commissions. So because the international commission is the one who promote in the promotions of the progress development of international law codification itself. And international law commissions are made up of a bunch of legal experts in almost every single field since the establishment of the UN. So they have a lot of scholars, experts, and they work around the clock to produce those kind of drafts so that if one idea initiations come up, they could just put for state to negotiate rather than if a treaty could be existed in 50 article, you can't just come together and talk about one article, how to create one article each 50 times. No, it's take a lot of time. So they let they lay the ground job to the international law commissions. And during the adoptions, it requires all states participating in the negotiations process to agree. Because if, I don't know, I can't remember well how come they it is super majority, of course, with the 2/3, but I don't know what, I forget the idea of why are they choosing 2/3 rather than sometimes 50 plus 1 or anything. Uh, but they require a 2/3 mostly uh, for adoptions of a text or an international conference. It's been 40 years from the entry into force of VCT up until now. Things change a lot. Even though it requires all state or 2/3, but sometimes this provide a deadlock. For example, the conventions on the prevention and punishments of the crime against humanity, it has been drafted in the stage of international law commission for 40 or 50 years already. You barely have a conference to adopt it. It's still being drafted. That is the reason. Because a lot of states don't like it. I mean, by don't like it, they don't like to bind such kind of obligation over them. Because those about international crime. But according to law, it requires all states participating in the negotiations to agree a 2/3 of an international conference. And authentications of the text, which is the second stage of formations. Authentication of the text. How do you authenticate your contract, Odam?
Uh, by signing, sir.
By signing, and then done,
Yes,
deal,
sir.
right? Easy.
Yes, yes,
The
yes,
same,
yes, sir.
the same as international treaty. International agreements, authentications of the text are almost the same. Authentications of the text show that this text is final form of treaty. You sign, and then this you won't change whatever in there anymore. We're not going to discuss, okay, I wanted to change my salary, I want to change my working day. No. That is later on after it's enforced, you can amend it with agreement. But it is to make sure that this is the final text. You sign, you agree this is the final text. And mostly, signature by state authenticating the text, or state may agree on other way to authenticate the text. I don't know, especially this kind of COVID-19, there's a lot of agreement that being signed by states, but still it's not authenticated enough because they sign via video conference. and the way it's have to depository works and stuff, it's kind of mixed bags. But no, generally, signature by the state authenticate the text, just like the contract between individuals. It's qualified the signatory state to proceed to be bound, which means that after you sign, you're going to process of going to fully bound it by a stage called consent to be bound and ratifications. It's create, even though it's not enforced, even though it's not bound, the principle of Pacta Sunt Servanda came into play already. As long as you sign, you are expected to create an obligations of good faith from doing something that is against the object and the purpose of the treaty, even though it's not bound yet. As long as you sign, there is an expectations of obligations of good faith. It's not that to follow or to act as the obligations that is stipulated in the treaty. They just expect you to have an obligations of good faith from not doing anything stupid or doing anything bad against the treaty, you know. After the authentications of the text, it moving to the consent to be bound. Different from the authentications, which mostly only exist in signing Article 11 of the Article 11 of the VCLT give different way to express the consent to be bound. Article 12 say that you can express consent to be bound by signature when agreed by states, and Article 13 say that you can express consent to be bound via exchange of instrument when agreed by states. So it could also signature, it could also exchange of instruments. And Article 14 says that you can express consent to be bound by ratifications when agreed by state. So there are three ways. And another way is only happen when the state was not participating in the negotiations. They could also express their consent to be bound by the process called accessions. So again, consent to be bound could be expressed in signature, in exchange of instrument, and by ratifications. Uh, Ratification is a diplomatic procedure. Most states have the ratification process in order to have the consent to be bound, or we could say that this is the most famous or popular way, or practical way to show to express consent to be bound. For us, Cambodia, we always have to make a ratification process in every treaty we sign. For example, the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreement is already signed, so we kind of show off a expressions of authentications of the text already. So in order for the consent to be bound to fully finish, China and Cambodia have to go through ratification process, or we could call it the internal procedure or domestic procedure. For Cambodia, as long as I remember, we have to go through the Council of Ministers, and then uh, we have to go through the send from the government to the National Assembly. When National Assembly approve, uh, the government have to defend at the Senate as well. After the Senate's approved, we'll have to send for formality process via His Majesty the King, so that he could sign and promulgate. Then at that time, after the promulgation from His Majesty the King, uh, the ratification process is considered as being done, and we relay that ratification process to the other party, which is China. Right now, we are not done yet. We're kind of in the process of doing it regarding the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreements. And if you look at the another example is the U.S. itself, it has to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. So regarding the last methods of consent to express consent to be bound is accession. It is different from the other three because this kind of method could only be expressed by state who were not taking part in the negotiation process. For example, Cambodia, we kind of we kind of yeah, through the UN we accession. So we provide accessions to join the UN because by the time of 1945 that the UN was established, we were still under colonizations of the French. So we're not independent yet. So we're not taking part of the UN. And I don't know what time. What year did we join the UN? Anyone knows?
1954, sir, if I'm not mistaken.
Right away after the independence.
Yeah, sir, because we want to gain recognition fast, I think.
Yeah. So that way, that was the time that we expressed our consent to be bound by the United Nations Charter through accessions. So this is the pure best example. Because why? We were not in the negotiating stage. Um, this is not another method. It is just Article 16 continue to explain that ratifications have to be communicated. So says you can express consent to be bound by an exchange of or deposit or instrument of ratifications or acceptance or approval of access unless otherwise agreed. Like the case of our Cambodia, when we provide accession at the UN, we have to submit or deposit the instrument of ratifications at the United Nations Secretary General, so that after that document is being deposited, then it's become binding into force. If we're talking about the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreement, uh, the full consent to be bound considered to be done is when the Chinese receive our ratifications, how do you call it, document to show that we have ratified, and also we would receive the document saying that the state of China went through the internal regulations already and ratified the Cambodian China Free Trade Agreement already. So when both parties exchange that instrument, and then it become binding. So the VCLT opens for way like this, unless otherwise agree. Simply mean that both party or parties to the conventions could state whatever you want, saying that okay, they consent to be bound as long as I don't know, uh, prime minister sending a letter to each other saying that hey, we agree, we already went through our parliament, whatever it is, as long as all party agree, it's fine. Contract is pure and free as long as it is not violating the principle of international law. So this is just an open clause for parties to treaties or agreements to, codify whatever they want to codify, as long as it's in accordance to international law itself. Entry into force. So entry into force is the last stage of formations, or a last stage of how we create treaty. After the ratification, even though we exchange, but at the entry into force is exactly like not exactly like the date of ratifications of instruments. Article 24 of the VCLT says that state may may specify a date or a number of parties needed before entry into force. If not, all when all negotiating state consent to be bound. Normally, I can raise two examples. One is the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreement, or the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreement stated that the present conventions will the present agreements or the CCFTA will be in force 60 or 90 days after exchange of instrument of ratification through diplomatic channel. So it doesn't have a specific dates. It has a formula of two triggering points. One, the date of exchange of instrument of ratification through diplomatic channel plus 60 or 90 days. For, let's say, both party exchange instrument of ratifications on the 1st of January 2021. The convention itself will be entered into force 90 days after that. So you count 90 days, so it's around 3rd of March or 4th of March, then it's the convention will start to enter into force. This most likely about parties, two parties, or small number of parties such as 5 or 6 or 7. Normally, multilateral party with a lot of number of party, they never triggering the period because of the exchange of instruments of ratification. Mostly, they put a formula of number of parties need to be needed to submit instrument of ratification before entering into force. For example, the Rome Statute. So the Rome Statute created the International Criminal Court. The negotiations during the 1998 5-week conference to finalize and adopt conventions. And at the end of that conference, they signed, accepted by most states delegates. So those states who accepted, they signed. And it entered into force in 2002. Why? It was adopted in 1998, but it's entered into force 4 years later. Why? Can anyone think of something or know of the reason why it take them 4 years to enter into force?
Because they set the time to join at that time.
Time to enforce the treaty or time to join?
Time to entry into the force.
So they time it as a date. The triggering period is timeline. Anyone else have different idea?
Teacher, is it because they need a number of states to ratify before it enters into force?
Yes. So it need numbers of state to ratify to enter into force. As far as I remember, it's 60 something. Yeah, 60 something. So before that number, for example, oh, I forgot it. For example, 60 state. If there's only 59 state ratify, it could take forever waiting for that one state to ratify and then to make sure that the Rome Statute are entered into force. It could take forever for an eternity if you cannot find the 60 states. But no matter how short or how long it is, as long as there are 60 states who ratify the convention, the Rome Statute will come into effect mostly, maybe they said 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days from the date of 60 ratifications. As far as I remember, we are in around the Cambodia was ratified um, in April 2020. We were the 57 or 58, or I don't know. So we are among the numbers to need to fulfill in order to get the 60 or 63. So we ratified on 11 April 2002, but it entered into force in July 2002. So yeah. funny speaking, that is that the Rome Statute were negotiated for 5 weeks, and the Rome Statute is simply set up the World Permanent International Criminal Court, and it is interested by all parties, especially the P5, and it is concerned the P5 a lot because there are crime of aggression in there and core crime that mostly could be committed by powerful state only. This is the problem. Right now, only three, sorry, right now only two out of P5 are members of the ICC. Do you know who?
France and England.
Yeah, the three more never ratified. They were part of the negotiation process. Some of them even signed, but they never ratified the treaty up until today. And funnily speaking, just today, the prosecutor of the ICC itself announced, that it's, react to the ban of all ICC staff, specifically the investigation staff and the prosecutor, the bans of entry into the US. Because the US is afraid that the ICC is going to find something during the investigations of the case of Afghanistan that is potentially war crime and crime against humanity committed by the US soldier in the territory of Afghanistan. So there's a war of diplomatic, international criminal diplomatics going on right now between the US and the ICC. And funny that we're talking about this today. And if you look at the this treaty, you can see that even though some states participate in the negotiation process, but as long as they could never, as long as they don't see the benefit for them at the end of the tunnel, they would just ruin the whole treaty. They would just drop it there and walk away. And ICC were being negotiated too long, even before 1998. They've been negotiating for a permanent international criminal court since 1945. They were talking about having one. Why? Because they already set up the Nuremberg before. They already set up of the Permanent Court of International Justice before. So, of course, after the establishment of the UN, they want a permanent court as well. They've been negotiating for 40 or 50 years, but they never succeed. Up until a critical 5-week conference to finalize the convention in Rome, which finally the the Rome Statute is being adopted, but without three of the most important 5 players in the world: Russia, US, and China. And remember, regarding international criminal or international crime, mostly could only committed by powerful state and aggressive states, specifically the crime of aggressions. Because otherwise, who dare? Maybe their friend. We don't know. So there's the things to learn that sometimes states start negotiations, but then drop in the middle. Another example is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or we could call it in short RCEP. The RCEP have been signed by all 14, all 10 ASEAN member states, plus New Zealand, plus Australia, plus 15, plus Korea, plus Japan, plus China. But during the negotiations for like 10 years, there were 16 members, including India. After 8 to 10 years of negotiations, India walked away from the RCEP in the last year when members trying to conclude the agreement. They've been negotiating for 8 to 10 years and they drop it and walk away. They don't even sign, let alone ratify. So they just walk away. This shows that you can learn one thing. States negotiating for international agreements for the purpose of benefit for their own. It is an exchange of agreements, obligation, and right to make sure that they receive benefits and at least the same as their obligations, but mostly more than the obligations. They can see the profit of it, then they come into. For us, small state like Cambodia, sometimes we can see little benefit, but a lot of obligation, but still go on because we don't have choices. So this is the last example I can give you to summarize back. Again, what is treaty? Treaty consists of uh, three simple elements. Treaty is an international agreement with three elements. It is an international agreement in written form. It is an international agreement between two or more states, and it is an international agreement governed by international law. So always remember that. What is treaty? An international agreement. What kind of element of that international agreement? Three. Written form between two or more states and governed by international law. How do we form treaties? Formations. Okay, sorry. Before formations, regarding treaties, there are four main issues to talk about: formation, termination, modification, and interpretations. Specifically for formations, the stage of formation consists of four stages. One is the adoption, two is the authentication, three is consent to be bound, four is the entry into force. Simply saying, the adoption of the text is about negotiations and finalization of the text. When you have the text, you will have to authenticate the text. The general way to authenticate the text is signature. Signature by who? Signature by the delegates who send to negotiating the text. Mostly by designated minister or head of state or minister of foreign affairs or representative, such as the representative to the UN or representative to WTO or ambassador or Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, and other acting head of state, such as the head of the Senate or head of the Parliament or head of states or prime minister or president. So it could be any of them. After the signature, you have to express the consent to be bound, which could be in signature, could be in exchange of instrument, could be in ratifications, and could be in the terms of accessions. And how to deliver them is you have to either exchange or deposit such way of consent to be bound. And finally, the entry into force consists of variety of way, but mostly the entry into force would be defined with a specific date or number of party that ratify or in any other way that state party agrees as long as it does not violate international law. So this will be it for our today's class. Let's go through questions before we finalize our class and get to dinner. Questions? Anyone? Or you already had your dinner?
No question, sir. You explained very well, sir.
Class monitor? I mean, this could be a good thing or a bad thing. No question mean you
Uh,
absorb everything and you expect it to do well in quiz or exam if it just come out like this.
sir, for me, for this topic three about treaty, I think it's not that hard
Easy.
to get.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Did you
because
read?
it's not much, and you explain everything already.
Okay. So, but this is very foundation, but very important. Very important. I know it's easy, but very important. You have to remember all of it. So good. I'm happy to hear that. I mean, you don't speak for all, but at least you uh, get to say that. How about the others? Dalin, no question? Sinasa, no questions? All right. Maybe I should do oral exam for midterm. Maybe. So I'm still thinking about midterms. What?
Teacher, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Um, Teacher, what is an exchange of instrument?
What is an exchange of instruments? So, for example,
Yes.
uh, have you ever seen in the news that Ministry of Foreign Affairs receive like loan, not loan, how do we call it? Aid, international aid from other country, like Japan give us $70 million for 2020 for international development aid.
Yes.
Yeah. Have you seen them, exchange like a piece of paper to each other? They sit at the table and they sign and then exchange it with each other. That is the exchange of instrument of ratifications that create an international agreement between Japan and Cambodia. And the agreement would say that Japan would agree to give, I don't know, how do we call it, some free money and some loan to implement certain projects like this, blah 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 blah, in the period of 5 years, and we expect Cambodia to do this, do that, and Japan is expected to do this, do that. It is an international agreement. Exchange of instrument is when they, because when there is an international agreement, you have to have copies, right? You have to have a copy for Cambodia and a copy for Japan. And mostly it would be conducted in three languages: Khmer, Japanese, and English. So uh, both parties have to sign all three versions of language and then exchange it with each other. In short, that is called exchange of instruments. It could be face to face directly right away, or it could send through diplomatic channel. Like right now, the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreement, because we already signed and we have to go through the instrument of ratification. So, sorry, we have to go through the ratification process. So after done, we have to send to China, and China will send to us. Because of the COVID, we cannot go there and meet together. So something like that. Is that enough, Somtay?
Yes, teacher. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Teacher,
Yes.
I don't quite understand about the consent to be bound about the word accession. Can you explain again?
Okay. Let's go. Can you still see the screen sharing?
Yes, teacher.
Okay. So accession in this term, it's not about accession of a state. It's kind of similar to accession of states. For example, accession in terms of joining a treaty or consent to be bound by a treaty is simply a way for state to say that I want to be bound by this treaty. Even though I was not negotiating this treaty, I was not signing this treaty. So negotiations process can take years. Some state didn't exist. So they only found out when, for example, Cambodia. We talk about Cambodia having the independent 1954, 54, right? 54 or 53?
Three,
53, teacher.
three.
Yeah, 53. We have the independent on 53. And 54, we joined the UN by accession. Why? Because we cannot join the UN by consent to be bound of signing or submit the instrument of ratifications. We can still, I mean, the instrument of ratification we can still submit, but it submits in the form of assessing to the Treaty of the UN, because the UN was established under United Nations Charter since 1945. Back then we were still under colony, so we didn't join yet. We didn't even negotiate. So accession is the way of express consent to be bound for states that were not in the negotiating stage or participate in the negotiating states. It's just name for like after period. You understand?
Yes, teacher. Thank you. I'm clear now.
Okay. Any other questions? Let's talk about midterm because we're going to have a midterm in one session or two. Do you prefer open exam or do you prefer presentations or research or oral? And have you done any midterm with your other lecturer yet?
Not yet, teacher.
Not yet. Okay, because this is an unprecedented
Can I
case.
say,
Yeah,
can we do presentation instead of midterm?
can, but you have a short time to do presentation because I do not have intentions to have a presentation for the midterm from the first place because I have discussed with the DIS and they kind of not really favor that. It have to be in form of written exam. But since it's COVID-19 and we're studying online, it's really hard to have a written exam beside an open questions.
Sure, since it's COVID-19, you should let us pass auto, sure.
That's only work with the grade 12.
Yeah, but can we apply to year 3 too?
I mean, if DS allow, I mean, to be honest, I don't care about grading. I care about how student would understand the class or not. That is why my style of teaching, I do not, I don't even have written exam in my final exam. I only do presentations or oral exam. Because that is the two way who test your real capacity, ability to express it. Not just read and remember or copy and paste or codify it. So presentations, Gumbo may kind of suggest presentations. But presentation, how do you work together? Because you cannot meet each other, right? If presentation, you have to do in group because we don't have time for everyone to do presentations. Any other suggestions? Oral exam?
Sure, I think open question is also good, sure.
Okay, open will be a
Sure,
pain
but
for
is it
you to correct.
like writing an essay or something, sure?
Yeah, but it will be a pain for me to correct
Oh,
everything.
oh, so that's not easy, you know.
Yeah, and it's not easy for uh, to be honest. Last year I made it's an open question final exam, and there's a lot of students barely pass. I mean, they get like 60 or something. I hate to give that kind of score, but they barely pass. It is an open questions exam for final exam, and it is year 4. So, okay, so coming to 2 point. Oral exam is, you guys are like 30 people. If I spend 3 minutes each for 2 questions, then I spend 90 minutes. 90 minutes without rest, that will be 3 hours. That's a lot. Okay, so I will communicate with class monitors. Maybe we could have, I don't know, option for you to choose, but just to bear in mind that it could most likely be a research presentation or an open exam, or would not be, or a very quick quick exam that all of you have to open your webcam. Does anyone have webcam? Like everyone doesn't have webcam? Anyone here? Only you, right? Yeah, so buy your webcam tomorrow. Okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So
But later
maybe
can I use camera, phone camera instead?
I don't care as long as I can see you that you are not, you know, back or copy and paste or get the answer from someone.
Yes, yes, I got
Okay.
it.
All right. So that will be it for today. Dalia, I will send you follow-up text to see whether how we could arrange the midterm and when. Okay. So thank you very much. If you don't have any questions, let's call it. Wait, I take attendance with the participations. Okay. So have a good dinner and have a good night. Thank you.